Good morning, and thanks for joining us today for the launch of the BEAMA Climate Commitment. I'm Yzella Farmer, Director of Policy and Marketing at BEAMA, and your chair for the event today. We're joined today by a fantastic group of industry experts who will lead the discussion with us on the topic of industrial decarbonisation in our sector. If I may start with a few just very practical mentions as people still join the webinar as well about how the event will run. So with regards to the online platform we're using, I must mention that this session will be recorded and we provide our events as recordings to all our members and on the BEAMA website following the event. As attendees, you're muted, but please put forward questions in the question panel in your control panel provided. We really encourage you to engage in this panel session that will run later and pose your questions to the industry experts joining us. We'll address as many questions as we can in the panel session, and then we always try and follow up with others we weren't able to tackle following the event. You'll first hear from our 5 industry speakers, and then we'll move into a panel session for the second half of the event. If you have any technical issues during the webinar, please put a question in the questions panel, and my colleague Simon Harpin will be happy to help during the event, and hopefully we can address any issues if they arise. So I'm going to move just quickly into a quick introduction on the BEAMA Climate Commitment before I hand over to BEAMA CEO Howard Porter to say a few words. I want to start by just covering off the BEAMA Climate Commitment and explaining to you what this means for us today. So today we are launching our climate commitment. BEAMA first published our commitment to net zero in 2019 as the UK regulated for this target. But today we have developed this further, and it's now signed by 37 of the BEAMA members. And there are 3 key parts to this commitment now. First, as domestic and international businesses, we are committing to reducing our own emissions as well as meeting the needs of the supply chain for the transition to net zero by 2050. We support the application of the most rigorous science-based approach to setting targets in line with a 1.5 degree future. And we commit to the delivery of sustainable cradle-to-cradle products in our marketplace by 2050. So this commitment represents a significant step in establishing supply chain engagement on the delivery of industrial decarbonisation in the UK and meeting net zero. Without initiatives like this, we will not be able to get the collaboration we need to meet this target. It's worth noting that some of the signing members have more ambitious targets to 2030 or 2040 for net zero. But as an industry, we will commit to 2050. And this is acknowledging that some sectors and businesses can move faster than others. But key to all of this and central to our commitment is collaboration and engagement across the supply chain, helping to bring everyone forward to meet net zero. The commitment we've set out today is the start of work BEAMA are now taking forward to support our members in engaging with the wider supply chain on issues including reporting on Scope 3 emissions, measuring embedded carbon in complex products and associated work. We really hope this commitment that we published today will mobilise action across our supply chain to collaborate on the development of climate commitments and collaboration especially with government on the regulatory mechanisms that will support businesses in delivering this. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank our membership in coming together to make this important commitment. This is a significant step and we anticipate the list of supporting members to grow in coming months and years. We are already seeing through the sharing of best practice, which is stimulated by the publication of this commitment, that more and more companies are stepping up to set targets to 2050. These aren't always easy decisions, And in doing this, significant changes will and are being made to global operations within our membership. In many cases, steps being taken today are voluntary by businesses keen to ensure their future in a low carbon economy. And some of this is being increasingly driven by pressures from customers and through regulation, but it is still early days. And we are really honoured to have a number of BEAMA members who have signed this commitment joining us today to share their experience in setting targets within their businesses and how they are delivering on these. And we have panellists from key parts of our supply chain also speaking with us today. I really hope the panel session we have will touch on the work we now wish to address around reporting of Scope 3, how we tackle decarbonisation of complex global supply chains, and how we get this cross-industry collaboration. So I'll leave it there, and I'd like to now hand over to BEAMA CEO Howard Porter to say a few introductory words before we start the speaking session.
Thank you, Isella. And I say welcome everybody onto this webinar. I think this is an extremely important day in taking forward not just the BEAMA members' commitment, but the whole sector's commitment as we all get ready to make big changes in support of alleviating climate change. I'm particularly pleased to have colleagues from BSI, from Energy Networks Association, and from Energy UK on today's call. And I think those who are on the call today must understand this is a whole sector approach required. If one sector does something really positive and others don't, it does not end up with the solutions that we all need. So I'm afraid I can't join the rest of the call today. I have a medical issue I need to sort out, but I'm hoping and I anticipate this will be a very good session, and hopefully those joining the call, please ask the panel what they're doing, how they came about to make the commitments that they've made, because it's really important that across the BEAMA membership and the wider community, all companies are making the same, if not similar, commitments going forward. So on that point, I wish you a really good next couple of hours discussion, and say unfortunately I will not be able to join you from now on. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Howard. And I'd like to take this moment now to introduce our first speaker, Stephen Vallance, Sustainability Specialist at Scottish Power Energy Networks. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for an opportunity to present to you all today. Today I'm going to talk through my slide pack, which is a very snappy title of Introduction to SP Energy Networks Carbon Footprint and the Role of Our Supply Chain in Delivering Our Ambitious Carbon Reduction Targets. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So a slide I'm not going to talk to for very long at all, but just to introduce who we are, SP Energy Networks. I'm sure that most of you will be familiar with us as an organisation, but just a reminder that we have both transmission and distribution licences. We have SP Transmission and SP Distribution in the Central Belt of Scotland, and we have SP MAMWeb in North West England and Northern Wales. So yeah, just some high-level summary slides there, but I think that's probably enough of an introduction, and we'll move on to the sort of the pertinent content of the presentation. So if we could move on, please. So just to give a bit of background on our carbon footprint and our journey that we've been on. We started quantifying and reporting our carbon footprint in 2013-2014. We set a short-term goal and a medium-term goal, which are outlined on the screen. The short-term goal was 23 to 24. We do it in regulatory years, and that was a 15% reduction. That at the time seemed like it was going to be a difficult target to achieve, but yeah, we actually achieved that in our third year. So our short-term goal was quickly achieved. And we're now working towards our sort of medium-term goal. So just to note, this is our business carbon footprint, and looking at the trajectory, we've made some significant steps in a lot of areas. but yeah, one of the main challenges for our business carbon footprint is SF6, which has sort of remained fairly static. And yeah, that's something that I'll sort of highlight as we go through the rest of the slides. Go to the next slide, please. So that was the previous slide was our business carbon footprint, but in the last year we went through a process of increasing the amount of emissions that we report, and really looking at increasing the scope of the emissions that we report. So not just our direct emissions, but sort of outlining it across all scopes. So there's a couple of animations. If we could just go to the first one, please. We have set across our distribution licenses a carbon neutral target. So across scope 1 and 2, which is our direct emissions and our energy consumption, excluding losses, we will be carbon neutral by 2028. Go to the next animation, please. And so this is just the 80% absolute scope 1 and scope 2 emissions by 2028, which I outlined earlier. So that's our sort of medium-term goal by 2030. Go to the next slide, please. And this is really the new ambitious carbon reduction target that we've set. So if we could hit the next two animations, please. So we've set science-based targets at 1.5 degree reduction trajectory across all scopes, so scope 1, 2, and 3, which we'll come on to in a second. And that's equivalent to a 67.2% carbon reduction by 2035 based on a 2018-2019 baseline. Our current ambitious target is that at 2035, when we reach our science-based target, we will then remove fugitive emissions, so any emissions that we have left, and we will become net zero at 2035. And so that's very much our new and ambitious carbon reduction targets across the whole of SPEN. Go to the next slide, please. So when I say scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon footprint, I'll just outline this in more detail. Scope 1 is direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. And so that's SF6, fuel consumption, etc., etc. So things that we really directly emit. And that accounts for about 2% of our carbon footprint. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling. Energy networks are in the sort of unique position where we actually have to include losses across the whole of our network for in our scope 2. So our scope 2 carbon footprint is huge, and that's 59% of our carbon footprint. If we move on to the next slide, please, or the next animation. Scope 3, so this is a new area for us. This is scope 3. This is all emissions associated with our supply chain, essentially. So yeah, that can be anything from the embodied carbon of the infrastructure that we build and maintain, to the services of the various organisations that we purchase. So that's our scope 3 carbon emissions. And if we just hit the next 3 animations, please, just to give you context. 68% of our scope 1 comes from SF6 gas, which I highlighted earlier. 98% of our scope 2 comes from losses, and approximately 15% or 50% of our scope 3 carbon emissions come from embodied carbon, so the embodied carbon of the infrastructure that we build and maintain. Move on to the next slide, please. And so this slide is just to really highlight that our supply chain will play a critical role in our new ambitious carbon reduction targets. That I deliberately pulled out the percentages because SF6 gas, losses, and embodied carbon are all things that our supply chain will really be fundamental in reducing going forward. So if we could just do the next animation, please. Yeah, high influence on SF6 through lowering leakage rates and innovation of SF6 free equipment. Next animation, please. I'd say there's a sort of moderate influence on losses due to the development of increasingly more energy efficient equipment and through energy efficient cables. If we hit the next cable. And then a high influence on embodied carbon, and as I noted previously, or alluded to previously, embodied carbon is emissions associated with the materials, for example, that go into our infrastructure, the concrete, steel, for example, the aluminium, the embodied carbon of raw materials that go into the manufacture of equipment, and also the emissions associated with the manufacturing of equipment. So very much highly influenced by our supply chain. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So just something that I'd really like to highlight is the importance of carbon data on electrical equipment. So we had a pilot project on a 275 kV gas insulated switchgear, and if you just hit the next slide, please, I'd like to show the whole life breakdown of the carbon emissions associated with that. So the manufacture of the equipment was about 33% of the total carbon emissions. Over the whole life cycle of the asset, operational emissions were the vast majority, with sort of end of life treatment of the asset, sort of a relatively small portion of the carbon footprint. If you hit the next animation, please, I'd like to highlight in operational emissions. So over the life cycle of the asset, SF6 was again the highest sort of contributor to the electrical the carbon associated with that the equipment. And a sort of minor portion was associated with losses of the carbon footprint associated with the losses of that equipment. If we hit the next slide, please, just to show the embodied carbon breakdown. So the majority of emissions were associated with the manufacture of that piece of electrical equipment, and a significant proportion of the emissions were associated with the raw materials. So again, the steel, epoxy resin, aluminium, all the components that created the equipment, and a small portion of the carbon was associated with transportation. So A, transportation of raw materials to the manufacturing site, and B, transport from the manufacturing site to our site. So this was really a pilot study that took an in-depth look at the carbon emissions associated with a piece of equipment. So I hope that's sort of interesting, and certainly something that it was really good to sort of understand that in a more granular level of detail. We'll move on to the next slide, please. So very much to highlight the direction of travel that we're on, and this is a continuation of the slide before. So that pilot was done through EPDs and LCAs, which are sort of very detailed studies that we worked with our supply chain to understand as a pilot. And we're really looking to get this data as standard now from our supply chain. So in collaboration with National Grid, we've adopted a carbon product calculator tool, and ourselves, National Grid and SSE are all using the same tool. It's an Excel-based tool which allows suppliers to quickly add product information and create this profile, this estimation of whole life carbon emissions. And just something to note that will be increasingly common in our tenders as we move forward to start requesting this type of information from our supply chain. So we can first understand it and then start to work with our supply chain to try and reduce the carbon impact of the electrical equipment that we're buying. Move on to the next slide, please. Perfect. And then another direction of travel is really supply chain carbon ambition. So from all suppliers, we strongly encourage our suppliers to develop an understanding of their own carbon footprint, their scope 1 and scope 2 as a minimum. Support is available through the Supply Chain Sustainability School. They have a free carbon tool to develop a carbon footprint, and it's free for our supply chain to use this. So I've put the link on the screen, and certainly something that we might look to mandate in the future, that as a sort of minimum, our supply chain have a sort of conceptual understanding of their carbon footprint. For all key suppliers, and in this case, I've noted that key suppliers have an annual spend of more than £1 million. We strongly encourage our supply chain to develop science-based targets. We have set a target of 80% of our supply chain to sign up to science-based targets, and it's certainly something that we will, I say we will be mandating this in the future through sort of contractual mechanisms, and it's certainly something that we've made the commitment, so we need to try and look at mechanisms to contractually sort of mandate that in for our key suppliers going forward. So that's very much the direction of travel. If we move on to the next slide, please, I'd just like to give a summary of the key messages. So we as an organisation, SPEN, have set ambitious new carbon reduction targets, and they now include scope 3 emissions, so supply chain emissions. So we really need to work with our supply chain to reduce those emissions. Our supply chain will play a critical role in achieving these targets, and key message 1, data is key. We'll be increasingly requesting carbon information from the products we buy, and key message 2 is that we would like to see our key suppliers sign up to science-based targets aligning with our level of ambition, and also all our supply chain really to start trying to understand their scope 1 and scope 2 carbon footprint. And the next slide is just a sort of Yeah, thank you, and thanks for listening. And I've got my sort of email there, and if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to answer your questions if they're not asked on this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I think really important to hear from you there and really clearly outlining what requirements will be placed on the supply chain going forward. I know many of our members are key suppliers into the networks industry, and I think it speaks to the reason why we're creating that climate commitment, which is to try and embed some collaboration across the supply chain to figure out a way forward for all of this, the reporting, the data, and I hope we will come on to more of that in the panel session. So thank you so much. I'd like to quickly move on to our next speaker, and we'll address any questions in the panel session. So I'd like to introduce John Hiscock, from the Managing Director of Fundamentals, a BEAMA member and signing member of the BEAMA Climate Commitment. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Gisela, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving me a chance to chat through where we are as a business in regards to the journey to net zero. Yes, I'm John Hiscock, Managing Director of Fundamentals, and nicely following on from Stephen's presentation, I think we are a small or an SME company involved in helping improve the health and performance of the grid is our strapline, and I will explain what I mean by that shortly. You'll notice immediately that we have a more aggressive target internally, net zero 2030, and I'll explain why that's the case as we go through. Next slide, please. The first slide, this is, forgive the pun, a bit of an icebreaker, but demonstrates really that things have changed very significantly in not too many years, really. This is a picture of an ad in Life magazine back in, well, nearly 60 years ago, almost bragging about how much ice how much ice they can melt by the energy they supply. So as I say, it's really significantly moved since then, and obviously as we build up to COP26 and net zero is pervading all sorts of news channels, media, so there's a lot of pressure on everybody to get on board with this one. Next slide, please. Just quickly a bit about the company Fundamentals. So we've been involved in power systems technology for several decades now, more than 30 years experience. I mentioned earlier health and performance of the grid. That neatly summarizes what we do, and indeed why I think we're well placed to help deliver net zero targets. The health bit is really about the fact that we've got a legacy electricity system that was designed to provide power from the top of the network to the bottom. Things have changed significantly, but the legacy assets preclusively expensive to replace wholesale in order to deliver a net zero system, which after all would be the simplest way of doing it. Let's just replace it, but of course very, very expensive to do so. So we've got to make the best of what we've got. That's the health bit, keeping the assets alive and well. And the performance, you know, the grid was designed without embedded generation, without low carbon technologies in mind. So in order to make the grid perform as we need it to, it's quite a challenge. So we're really specialists in voltage control. Voltage is going to be an increasingly important aspect of grid technology as we connect more and more low carbon technologies, and yeah, so we're developing new solutions, and our key customers are the likes of Scottish Power and other DNOs. So next slide, please. Yep, an international footprint. Although we're an SME, we're based in. I'm sat here in Swindon at the moment. But we have an operation in Bristol and in Oldham. But further afield in Australia, we have some partners in the west coast of the United States and some representation in the Middle East and Malaysia. So, you know, the global reach of the operation continues to grow, and therefore considerations which we'll get onto around Scope 3 emissions, what have you, is an important important consideration for us. Next slide, please. Our key customers, I've mentioned the DNOs already, but also the Australian equivalent, industrial and generation companies, system integrators and OEMs. So very much the electrical industry. And of course, that's why we're here today talking about how we're going to deliver net zero as we electrify heat and transport. It's going to be increasingly important that everybody on this page and more adopt the kind of things we'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. The problem, and I would say the opportunity for fundamentals as a business, really is the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, increasing low carbon technologies on the existing grid is going to require more dynamic voltage control. There is a need to deliver statutory voltage levels for statutory requirements. It's in the grid code. So there's going to be a more of a need for new solutions around voltage control. So in a way, we very much view this drive towards net zero as an opportunity. Next slide, please. Why net zero 2030? Well, we're a signed up BEAMA company. We're very, very happy to be a part of the campaign, and we feel we've got a very important part to play within that. But I think, as Gisela mentioned earlier, smaller players like us are more able to get on with things, I suppose, and deliver more aggressive targets. So we've set down a target internally for the organisation for net zero 2030. There are other reasons, showing some leadership. I think building up to COP26, I think the UK PLC very much has an opportunity to show some leadership, and the companies involved also. I think there is some evidence that businesses who don't get on board with this are going to have a hard time developing new business models, the circular economy, all these considerations. And as Stephen himself just said, as a key customer of ours, pretty soon we're going to be expected to provide evidence that we are a sustainable business ourselves. So there's also a very clear need for us to get on and do this. Typically, businesses working towards this can be more profitable. And although the scale of the challenge is enormous, a lot of it can be controlled through design. But there are advantages as well, improved efficiency, recruitment prospects, where I think ESG, so environmental, societal, governance type considerations are becoming more important. Typically for let's say younger engineers coming through, would expect companies to be talking about this and taking it very seriously. Consumer choice, regulatory compliance is a big one. Again, we would expect our customers to be insisting on certain standards to be met, and it can drive innovation as well, of course. When you really need to get on and solve problems, which is certainly what we do as a business, it can create some new thinking, some new innovation. Certainly, digitization and things like machine learning and AI going to be important, innovative type developments, certainly for us, and other competitive advantages as well. Next slide, please. Well, I think the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 type considerations for any company are clearly set out, and it's the scope 3 ones, in my view, which are obviously probably more pertinent for an organisation like ours as we globalize, as we develop more products, as we grow as a business sustainably, profitably. Then there are a lot of considerations to be made there. But the first step in any progress is, of course, trying to recognise existing positions. So we're in the throes of trying to work that out. Very nice to see from Stephen's slides how well developed the numbers are within a business like Scottish Power. We're certainly not at that stage yet, but of course it's the first step we have to make, and we're beginning to look at how we can do that. Next slide, please. Yeah, a bit of a confusing slide, I'm afraid, but I think the picture tells the story really from as we embark on this this work program. Yeah, there are some very confusing measurement techniques, statistical methods to assess, carbon, and I think there are lots of tools out there though, and lots of people who can help, and I think. Again, we're just embarking on trying to find the best way of measuring the net position as we stand. Next slide, please. So yes, continuing the steps for net zero 2030. There is a lot of information and tools available out there. Government regulations, we're a member of the SME Climate Hub. There are standards development. I think we'll hear a bit more about that this morning. And of course, working groups. I mentioned BEAMA. Obviously, this is a BEAMA campaign we're involved with today, but of course there are others, and we need to learn from each other. What we'll do once we know our existing standpoint or existing position, conduct gap analysis, try and work out how we then move forward, set the goals and KPIs and good stuff like that, and implement things. It's sort of stating the obvious really, but an example of one of the things we've recently talked about that we're probably going to implement is there are a fair few plug-in hybrids and electric vehicles at our business. We've installed plenty of charging points, make them available to visitors, but employees, and they're well used. And I think the question is, well, that's arguably, free fuel for employees who are using that, and so we're working out a way of how employees utilizing that can make a contribution back, either in carbon credits or something of that nature. We're not quite there yet, but we that's what we'll intend to do in the next few weeks. So that's just one example of one of the initiatives we're looking at. Next slide, please. Which actually brings me to the end of my slides. In a way, a call to action in some ways, I suppose. Really, the scale of the challenge for net zero in any respects is massive, but equally it's an enormous opportunity, and I'm personally excited to be involved in the BEAMA organisation to help move all this forward. So thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Really interesting, and I think there's already some consistent points being raised around the challenges in assessing Scope 3 and how important that data and measurement piece is, and I think we will come on to that in the panel session. So I'd like to quickly move over onto our next speaker, and I'd like to introduce Olivia Whitlam, Head of Sustainability at Siemens. Thanks for joining us, Olivia, and over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm maybe going to take a slightly different angle. I thought I'd make this quite personal to, our own emissions, the challenges we've faced, and why the kind of BEAMA climate commitments are so vital to kind of making a step forwards. So could we go next slide, and just a very quick overview of the kind of classic science-based targets commitment that you'd expect of a company like Siemens. And we're obviously not big owners of infrastructure, but we do supply the energy infrastructure with lots of different kinds of equipment. In the electrical and digital spaces especially. And for us, the classic commitments of 100% EV fleet, net zero buildings, 100% renewable power, but also expanding into that Scope 3 piece around supply chain reductions, reducing it to 20% with sort of by 2030, and a full net zero supply chain by 2050 are public commitments that we've made globally. But our Siemens PLC business, our UK business, wants to go beyond that. And if we go to the next slide, you can see the work we're starting to do on our own emissions. In 2015, the commitment was initially made to be carbon neutral by 2030. So we'd already started to make some impact. We've been buying 100% green electricity, REGO certified since 2016. Not solely. We're working very hard on energy efficiency itself as well. Obviously, less power is better. But the real kind of hard piece to tackle is the gas and the fleet. And for us, the fleet makes a significant contribution. So we've already made the commitment to transition to a full EV fleet in the UK. But alongside that goes all the work that needs to go into charging infrastructure. And that's not just at our office sites. When we're looking at kind of our commercial vehicles, our smart meter installers are using, it's not just about the vehicle being an EV. It's often stored at their own house. So, you know, overnight they're parking outside their own houses. How are we going to make sure that they have suitable charging on 100% green electricity? And we've got roadmaps now for all of this, working through piloting the commercial vehicles using our own Siemens VersiCharge chargers to make sure that we can kind of connect them up to green electricity supplies using our own WeGo certified contracts, so that we can ensure that as much of that fleet as possible is running on 100% green electricity. For our gas emissions, perhaps simpler, something that we can, you know, solely tackle in our own facilities, and that's involved very individual roadmaps for each facility. Our buildings are quite different. I'm sure it's the case for anyone who, you know, has multiple buildings in multiple locations. Some of them are Victorian, some of them are more modern. They all have different pros and cons just based on their location in terms of decarbonisation. So we've had to take a really individual approach to each building, and we're just lucky enough that we have the kind of expertise internally to do the consultancy elements internally, look at what the best solutions are. Air source heat pumps for one site, fully electrifying its heating in that way makes a massive difference, and obviously would be a huge preference for us to electrify heating. But actually, where we've got a large footprint site, in our Electrium business, we're moving to biomass heating because it's flexible. It allows us to target the heating to certain areas. It can be moved in the future. It reduces the overall energy demand, and it doesn't mess with the huge amount of asbestos that's in the roof. So, you know, taking those kind of things into account as we've gone along has meant we've had to take a really detailed approach to each site, each type of vehicle in our fleet. And that's then allowing us to massively reduce these kind of emissions, which in all fairness are not massive in the first place, because like I say, we don't own this big infrastructure the likes of SP do. Where we come to the complexity is definitely in our scope 3 emissions. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a very kind of light overview version of what Siemens PLC, so the UK business's scope 3. So this also includes the stuff we buy from our parent company overseas. And we do this obviously at group level, at AG level as well. And we kind of get everything gets outweighed by the amount of components we buy. And that's where scope 3 gets really difficult. I know from various studies we've done into our own supply chain that only about 50% of our UK suppliers can actually tell us their own emissions, their own scope 1 and 2, let alone go any further. And when you're buying a component from them to make into, you know, a particular product, you're already into the point where you can't be asking about the raw materials go into it, because sometimes those components are made of other components and so on and so forth. With so many tiers down the supply chain, to, you know, make our goods, the goods we're purchasing, it becomes really, really complex. So it's no longer just well, we want to measure this, let's go and find some numbers. It starts to become something we have to support the whole supply chain to be able to do. And I think that's really important. It's nice and it's great when we have a really large piece of equipment that we manufacture mainly from raw materials, you know, a big piece of switchgear or something. That's pretty easy. We can do an LCA. I say it's pretty easy. It's not easy at all. Anybody who's done an LCA will know that. But it's a lot easier than when you've got these multiple small electrical components that I'm sure a lot of our businesses are having to deal with. And that's when we start to have to come together as a community, to be building up, you know, our competencies together, to be working on standardization of how we report these things, because I know we all get asked by customers, you know, very different kind of ways of cutting our carbon. You know, do they want the carbon's footprint of the product? Do they want our actual scope 3 emissions cut based on greenhouse gas protocol? Do they want it for PLC? Do they want it for AG? And actually standardizing these requests so that we can give our customers the best kind of information that really helps them understand the carbon, but also means that we can all practically do it, is really, really important. And I think we need to be having the conversations like we're having today that give each other this transparency of what's going to be needed and where those kind of challenges sit to enable us to do it. that's me, nice and short and sweet. I'm going to hand over to the next person. Look forward to the panel questions.
Thanks so much, Olivia. A really, really good presentation, and I think speaks to this kind of growing message of building competency across the supply chain is just so important. I'd like to hand over to Lee Nurse, Business Development Director at Volution Group. Thanks so much, Lee, and over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, basically, just as a quick overview, so Volution, a specialist in indoor air quality. You might not know Volution, but you might know our brands. We trade it through Ventaxia and Manrose, amongst others in the UK. We trade across 3 geographies, the UK, continental Europe and Australasia. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of what we do. Next slide, please. I think just to introduce myself, I'll go through some slides here just to introduce you to our sustainability strategy. It's a little bit wider than just our emissions, although we'll deal with our emissions at the end. What I would say is we're probably earlier on our journey. Well, we are definitely earlier on our journey than some of the people that presented so far, but we'll give you a bit of an overview of how we've gone about trying to establish our strategy here. Not just about carbon, we're committed to a low carbon future, but also the wider piece for our business. Next slide, please. So I suppose the first point was that we had to go about rewriting our purpose as a business. What are we? What is it that we choose to do? What we're very conscious of the fact that the products that we sell, and more of the products we sell certainly become more and more energy efficient, and they actually do form a significant part in how we will decarbonise our buildings moving forward. We sell heat recovery ventilation, for example, which recovers more energy than it uses. And as buildings decarbonise, those types of technologies will be a key to help us hit our wider net zero carbon emissions through our country. Sorry, with 40% of the energy being used that we do use in buildings, it's obviously important we decarbonise them. Next slide, please. So contextually, the markets that we operate in all have their own ambitious energy targets. And actually, we have one country, Australia, we trade in, which is unique, actually. The rest of them all have net zero carbon targets, either in law or in policy. So there's a general trend for our geographies to continue to work towards net zero, all around the 2050 target. I don't think anyone's brought it forward, maybe some have. But the principle is that our products and the regulations within those countries are all changing to help those countries deliver their own net zero carbon objectives, of which our products and components will form a significant part of that solution. So our ambition is to get our product range with the lowest possible carbon intensity and the most sustainable position possible, because we know those products will end up being energy positive anyway in their use. Next slide. So I suppose the important thing for us was to actually go through a materiality analysis and start to understand what it is that we actually do as a business. It's really important that you know what you are and you know what you're not. There's certain things we couldn't do from the point of view of sustainability, or indeed would be irrelevant. So we focused and we started this process last year. We're a PLC, FTSE 250, so this was all captured in our annual report, and we started reporting it. Our next annual report, which has got greater clarity around some of these disclosures, is out towards the end of October, so there'll be more content. But directionally, we started the process by really mapping what it is that we do and what's the most significance for us, and from the point of view of the most significant impact it has on our wider stakeholder group, and then aligning those elements to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but specifically around what we do. And that's kind of led us to create kind of 3 pillars. Next slide, please. So really what we identified is that our operations and the business that we have, we could identify our key sustainability initiatives into 3 pillars, one being product, one being planet, and one being people. Quite clear, really. First of all, our ambition is to champion the energy saving potential of our product range and to continue to develop products that are lower carbon or help save carbon in their use. So I suppose that's a product pillar. The next one was the planet. What do we do from the point of view of the operations of our business? How do we operate? What do we actually do on a daily basis? And what can we do to improve and reduce the negative impact that our operations have on the planet? And the third one is people. What do we do about our people? And how do we make sure that we have got an engaged and inclusive workforce and continue to try and do the right thing from a social perspective? So that's really the 3 key areas of our strategy, and we created some key KPIs around those. So next slide, please. So these kind of pillars brought our ambitions into scope, and then what we thought we'd try and do is identify what types of actions we could do within those 3 pillars. Obviously, from the point of view of product, and the kind of actions, we could increase sustainability of our product portfolio. We could work with different industry partners to try and improve our products, and also make sure that we had good supply chain collaboration to really resolve some of the issues we had with materials, etc. Under planet, obviously the key one, which we'll talk about a little bit more, and which a lot of people are focused on today, is mitigating carbon emissions. Very, very key thing. How can we do that? How can we optimize sustainable materials? And how can we also reduce the waste through our supply chain, ensure we're acting as responsibly as possible? And then people, I think the key one for us was really ensure that we champion a zero harm culture, make sure our staff are fully engaged, and make sure that they are engaged in our sustainability policy. What I would say is that process was extremely positive. Generally, our employees have reacted very, very positively to a sustainability launch that we did internally when we launched this policy last year. And actually, I think the reaction from our employees has been so positive. We've found lots and lots of areas of improvement that would have been hard to find without their involvement. So that's been good. Next slide, please. So the key thing really was for us to set some long-term objectives. When I say long-term, actually they're relatively short-term. We were talking about by 2025. So what could we do by 2025 as a business? So first of all, we were committed to increasing the carbon impact, or sorry, reducing the carbon impact by selling larger numbers of low carbon products. Sorry, apologies, lots of positive and negatives in that sentence. So we had a target that 70% of our sales revenue would be from products that we consider low carbon. Now, low carbon products are those that, when used, is an alternative to a traditional method, use low energy. That product definition is aligned quite tightly with FTSE Russell Index as well. So we managed to get the green economy mark last year, which has been very, very positive. We've set ourselves a target of delivering 70% of our sales from those products by 2025. Quite an interesting target for us to set ourselves on. So it's not completely in our control, but of course it helps us allocate our capital and acquisitions that we make, and also ensure that we promote our products as effectively as possible. Last year we delivered 59%, and this year we've just announced 62.1%. So we're well on the journey there. We're moving 3% in the last year alone, which is really, really positive. The next KPI was looking at the materials that we use, and actually we set ourselves quite an aggressive target here of achieving 90% of the plastics that we process. Oh, not quite finished the previous slide. 90% of the plastics that we use for our products from recycled sources. 90% by 2025 is quite a stretching target. We can't quite find the roadmap to that yet. We can get to 85% comfortably, but we're sure that the supply chain will improve over the next few years to enable us to hit that 90%. Last year at 56%, this year at 59.7%, but some of that was constrained because of supply chain issues, and actually we're now moving a considerable amount of our material to recycled. All of our PVC is recycled now, 100% recycled. High impact polystyrene is 90% recycled. We're just trialing ABS. So this year we'll make a very big transitional jump, and we envisage from the point of view of percentages. So that's looking really, really positive. And then we started to record our accidents. We only had 1 accident last year, and this year we had 6 reportable accidents, which is unacceptable. We've changed the process of reporting now. Our CEO is informed immediately as soon as there's a reportable accident of any type. And we've also started to record our frequency rate of accidents per 100,000 hours of work, on the basis that as we grow, our business is getting bigger, we're acquiring more facilities, and actually the opportunity for accidents to occur is greater the more plants that you have. We think this will give us a better form of measure as we grow, as well as targeting the local management teams more aggressively and improving their safety record. Next slide, please. So I think that from all of that, you can see that we're taking steps to make our product and our organisation more sustainable from the point of view of the materials we use. A lot of the challenges around scope 3 that have been described by previous people presenting today are exactly the same for us, of course. What I would say is generally by the products we make, the majority of them are in plastic, and an awful lot of our scope 3 emissions are actually in transport and freight. That's the biggest area that we have. Is well over 50% of scope 3. As scope 1 and 2 have been coming down, we have been focused on those, and we have been taking steps to improve our facilities and improve how we manage our business. You can see our scope 1 and 2 graph from the point of view of how that's reduced since 2014 when we listed. and we start to record that data for the first time and report on it. So our scope 1 and 2 is reducing significantly. The interesting thing for us, of course, is within the general maintenance cycle of our buildings, we are managing to upgrade them. So we're taking steps to improve the facilities. We put solar panels on our Reading facility, and we're certainly improving the wider facilities that we've got across our group over time. We'll continue to promote our low carbon product portfolio, and actually a large percentage of our carbon saving will come from the adoption of those products in the wider community through regulations and standards. So that's very, very important for us. What I would say as well is we'll continue to change and improve our disclosures around our scope 1 and 2, and having third-party assessment and some assistance in understanding our scope 3. I would agree the challenges around standardization of reporting of that information, and also how you actually get to it alone is a challenge, but we'll continue to improve it. We obviously are supportive of TCFD as well, so this year for the first time we'll be reporting on that, but we'll continue to try to improve our disclosures over time. And actually that's probably all I've got for today.
Thanks so much, Lee. Really interesting stuff. And I know that Volution are doing a lot around the material use and plastic use within your products, which I think is really important. We might come on to that in the panel session, because I think we've said in our climate commitment as BEAMA, it's not just about direct carbon emissions. This is also about materiality of the products that we make and place on the market. So thanks so much for that, Lee. I'm going to very quickly hand over to Katie Mills, Head of Sustainable Development and Innovation at Schneider Electric. Thanks so much, Katie, for joining us. I'll hand over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me, and great to be here this morning. Great listening to everyone else's presentations as well, and seeing the amazing commitments and steps that every organisation is taking in this sector, and the support obviously that BEAMA has released today is just another very positive step, and another voice that helps us really kind of push our mission forward. So for those of you that don't know Schneider Electric, we are in the kind of digital energy and process automation space, and have been focused really around energy efficiency and sustainability for the last 15 years. So next slide, please. This is our carbon pledge currently. So we have a 2030 net zero target for scope 1 and 2, and then for the kind of full scope 1, 2, 3, and we have a 2050 net zero target. We also have interim targets in the meantime, and this year we also kicked off our zero carbon project, which is working with our supply chain, so around 42,000 suppliers globally, to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, and then ultimately by net zero by 2050. So just to really kind of show, as everyone else has really, how that moves and how our carbon pledge looks. And there's also a kind of really important piece there is around the customer piece actually by 2025. So we have a target by 2025 to save 800 megatons of carbon from within our customers with either our green products or our efficiency products, or by helping them switch to renewables and looking at their sustainability strategy. So it's not just about our own kind of strategy and our own operations for the next 5 to 10 years, it's also about how we help our customers get there too. Next slide, please. So this year, Schneider released its most ambitious kind of strategy yet, and it's our 2021-2025 sustainability strategy impact report, and we have 6 long-term commitments as part of that. And I think what's really kind of important to highlight is that this report now goes beyond just environment. So we are looking at kind of natural capital, social capital, human capital across the Schneider Electric business globally, but also across the wider supply chain. And those 6 long-term commitments are looking at climate, resources, kind of trust and principles of trust within our entire value chain, looking at equal opportunities, again, across our entire value chain, but also within our own personnel and internally from a diversity and inclusion perspective, harnessing the power of all generations, so upskilling and developing new generations that are paving the way for the kind of green skills of the net zero economy that we desperately need. And then looking, and for the first time actually looking at how we really have an impact from grassroots, and each kind of country and zone now has local commitments commitments that it has put forward as part of its sustainability strategy. So it's the first time that we've kind of come down to within the kind of countries and zones to really look at what could have impact for them and how they can work within their local communities to have a positive impact. Next slide, please. So as part of those 6 long-term commitments, we have 11+1 targets. It's growing our green revenues to 80%. I mentioned the kind of 800 million tonnes saved and avoided CO2 emissions for our customers, and reducing the CO2 emissions from our top 1,000 suppliers by 50% by 2025. We also are then looking at our packaging and our materials. So we have a target to increase green material content in our products by up to 50% by 2025. And then we also have 100% of our primary and secondary packaging is free from single-use plastic and will only use recycled cardboard by 2025 too. So again, looking at that materials point, which is a really important part. And we've actually been working quite closely with a couple of our customers on looking at packaging innovation projects on how we can do things in a more kind of circular economy way and with new and different materials. We've also then got 100% of our strategic suppliers provide decent work to their employees. So this is one step above kind of basic living wages. It's about going that little bit further and improving people's lives within our value chain as much as we possibly can, as well as measuring the levels of confidence of our employees to report behaviours against our principles of trust. We're also focusing on increasing gender diversity, from hiring to frontline managers and leadership teams as well. So we've had a huge focus on that even over the last kind of 2 to 3 years, but even more so now, a bigger push on diverse talent, diverse thought, ultimately is what's going to drive the innovation of Schneider Electric forward for the future. And then providing access to green electricity to 50 million people through the Schneider Electric Foundation. And this is a really important part of our mission moving forward, is about how we give access to green electricity and green energy to people within developing nations, and how we can help support bring more and more people out of poverty and into the kind of net zero economies of the future. And then we're looking at different opportunities for the next generation. So it's not just about university graduates. It's great that we have them, but it's also looking at the number of interns and apprenticeships we have. We're part of the 5% club around apprenticeships, and we believe that that is a massive part of our diversity and inclusion policy, is around where and how we source new talent, and also for diversity of thought. We want people from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds. And then we have another target of to train 1 million people in green energy management by 2025. And again, this is done with Schneider Electric on the ground, but also with our Schneider Electric Foundation, to really support all of those countries in which we operate, to make sure that we are training as many people as we can with green skills that are going to be that are already desperately needed. And then the final piece, the +1 piece, really is around our local commitments. And so within every zone and every country in Schneider Electric now, we have 3 local commitments that have been put forward that are to make a kind of true impact on the local communities that sit around our business on the ground. So we're having not just a top-down approach, but also a bottom-up approach. Next slide, please. And this is just to give you an idea of how we're focusing on things within the UK and Ireland. So obviously that's very much kind of the bigger Schneider piece, but then what does that mean for us within the country and within the zone? So we kind of break this down into 4 steps to our as part of our sustainability strategy. The first one is around efficiency, and I've heard lots of people speak about this, which is great. We've been on an efficiency program really for the last 8 years, but we still have work to do. And there's still, as the business starts to grow and is growing, there becomes bigger challenges around efficiencies. So we are continuously readdressing and relooking at our efficiency programs, and also looking at smart factory and digitization programs across our own sites in the UK as well. So we're implementing our own digital technologies and our own smart factory programs across our manufacturing sites. Then obviously the second step then is around decarbonisation. This includes net zero sites. So all of our sites will be net zero by 2030. That includes ones we own and also ones that we are kind of renting. So whether that means we have to switch to make sure that we're in carbon, that we're in net zero sites, or actually we're actually working a lot with landlords at the moment on how we can work together with them to get our sites to net zero when we aren't owners of it. We also currently are at 86% renewable energy across all of the sites, and we have a target to be at 90% by 2025. The remaining 10%, and I've heard everyone say this is gas for us, which is the biggest challenge. And actually, we're looking at some really interesting kind of system change approach to gas. So gas is actually used on a lot of our sites for production processes, and so we're looking at how we can take a completely different approach, not just swapping one technology for another, but looking at the process and the outcome and how we can achieve the same outcome by using a completely different process. So we can eliminate the kind of need for gas and the high temperatures that are kind of used as part of the manufacturing processes. We started our EV fleet rollout this year, so we'll be 100% EV fleet by 2025 in the UK and Ireland at Schneider, and this also includes working with our employees on net zero employee projects. So we're actually about to kick off our first net zero employee homes program. So we actually put 5 battery storage units up for grabs as part of a competition that our employees could apply for, those that are also kind of getting EVs and have solar and things like that. And we're now working with them with our own technologies to help drive their homes to net zero as part of our internal policies. And then the final piece really around decarbonisation is microgrid projects across our sites. So we are looking at, we're in the process of installing a microgrid at our Coventry site right now, and the next one after that will be our Leeds site. And ideally, these will allow us at times to operate as total kind of island sites, so completely off grid, and with the additional generation that we're putting alongside battery storage and our EV charging. It really is an opportunity for us to completely decarbonise those sites in every way possible. The third piece of the puzzle for us, which is a new piece this year, is around biodiversity. And this is a really important part of our strategy moving forward. Schneider Electric released its first biodiversity report this year, and we ended up being able to put a biodiversity score across our entire end-to-end value chain. And now it's about how we then translate that down for every country and every site then within those countries. So we have a target of no net biodiversity loss across all sites by 2030. We also are currently working on biodiversity impact reports and plans for every site, so that everyone can, so that everyone has a very clear program in getting them to net zero. Into getting them to net biodiversity loss. And then the final piece really of that is around biodiversity scores. So it's the typical, what you don't, what you can't measure, you can't improve. So we are working in many different innovative ways at the moment to put biodiversity scores across our sites. If anyone's interested in the kind of white paper on that, on how we do that, we'll be happy to share. But we are basically working alongside some local NGOs, but also alongside some startups who allow us to put beehives on a lot of our sites. We collect pollen on a quarterly basis, and then the diversity of that pollen starts to give us an idea of the diversity of species that sit within a defined area of each of our sites, so we can start to really build out a score around biodiversity and see how that is impacting every site that we have. This is also a really key part of some of our reporting. So Schneider is closely aligned to the TCFDs, and as part of the TCFDs, we're obviously looking at our climate financial risks. And a lot of that is around environment, and biodiversity plays a huge important alongside that in protecting the environment around our sites from flooding, from water scarcity. All of those different things is how our biodiversity program is playing a massive role in. And then finally, what I mentioned actually is around our community engagement. So across the UK, we have 3 main programs that we're working on around community engagement. First is around protecting ancient woodland across the UK and Ireland. There's some great initiatives around tree planting, and everyone, you know, if you can do that, that's absolutely fabulous. But then we end up forgetting a little bit about our ancient woodland, which ultimately are the much bigger trees who can take in far and far more carbon. So we're looking at what we are working with organisations to protect ancient woodland, and for our people to also get involved in projects around protecting ancient woodland. The second piece really that we're focusing on is around upskilling young people. So again, working with local NGOs across all different sites within Schneider Electric, within the UK and Ireland, whether that's in Ireland, whether that's in Wales, whether that's in the north of England or south of England, and really working on developing green skills needed for net zero economies, so that we are, you know, bringing through the next generations of talent that are needed, but also giving opportunities to young people that maybe wouldn't have got access to such opportunities before. And then finally, I mentioned it before, but the kind of third piece of the puzzle for us on the community engagement side is actually about working with our own employees. So working with them to drive them forward with their own lives to get them to net zero, whether that's within their homes, whether that's transport, and basically educating them and giving them access to information and technology that in order that that enables them to really get to that net zero point within their own lives, and also then means they start to care more about what we do as an organisation. And one other final initiative that we have in the UK is we have an internal carbon fund within the UK and Ireland, where our country, our zone president, Kelly Becker, decided that, okay, well, you know what, we're going to tax all of our business units based on their emissions, and then we're going to pull that money into a central pot as a kind of carbon innovation fund, and then our employees can put forward projects that are helping us on our sustainability journey to be funded from that carbon innovation fund. And to date, this was kicked off in January this year, and we currently have 6 projects ongoing that have been put forward by people from all different parts of the business that are tackling all different issues around some of our sustainability challenges. So again, another great way of us doing more, but also bringing our people on that journey with us and utilising the knowledge and passion that everyone has within Schneider Electric. I think finally, just my final slide, please. Just our kind of our purpose really, and this is what drives us with our sustainability strategy every day, is around empowering all to make the most of energy and resources and bridging progress and sustainability for all. And at Schneider, we call that Life is On. So thank you for having us today, and I'm very, very excited to be part of the new BEAMA net zero mission, and you know, very keen to connect with anyone who would like to understand more about what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie, and I think a really strong message that you're providing at the end there in terms of, you know, employee-led initiatives within organisations to meet net zero. I think that's a really important point and something we're going to come on to hopefully in the panel session. So we are going to move into the panel session now, but I'd like to first of all start by introducing 2 additional panellists who are going to join us for that session, representing organisations that we work with very closely at BEAMA. I'll first introduce Charles Wood, Deputy Director Policy at Energy UK. And Charles, would you like to say a couple of words by way of introduction? A couple of minutes, 2 words.
Yes, certainly. So I'm Charles Wood. Energy UK, for those of you who don't know, is the energy trade association representing retailers, generators, and a whole bunch of people in between. And my focus is on energy systems. I'm Deputy Director of Policy, focusing on energy systems. That includes system stability, as well as the uptake of low carbon technologies like heat and transport. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Charles. And I'm now going to introduce David Thatcher, Head of Sector at BSI. And I know, David, you've got a couple of slides here just to introduce some work that you're doing. I think really important context to the discussion we're going to have in the panel session now.
Yes, indeed. I think some of the stuff I wanted to just touch upon briefly, it requires a little bit of a visual prompt. So yes, thank you for indulging me on this. I think when we talk about net zero, there are a lot of T words that come up, transition being the main one. I note that together was used in BEAMA's commitment, quite rightly so. I think we've heard a lot today about the importance of collaboration. And I think we've also heard the next two T words quite a few times as well, trust and transparency. And I think they are essential in terms of net zero, and that's why standards are so important. I think all of you listening today are probably very aware of this, but the process by which standards are developed is through this distillation of expertise that comes about when a standards body like us convenes thought leaders from across the policy, industry, regulatory, academic, and also societal public interest space. And then through that, a process of robust managed consensus, we get to agree and codify what does good look like. So I would actually like to take this opportunity in a way to thank BEAMA for actually being a really important voice around that table of stakeholders as BSI standards are shaped. That's BSI standards that are often international or European standards that have a strong UK voice, and that UK voice is in part provided by the experts from BEAMA. So next slide, please. Now we know that supply chains are long and global, and agreed good practice is really important to help organisations assess and quantify greenhouse gas emissions, manage and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, offset where manage and reduce has got as far as it can do, and then also support credibly the claims of carbon neutrality and at some point net zero as well. So that reporting is really important. But we also, so BSI sees standards as being major enablers in accelerating that T-word transition. But we also recognise that actually getting started can be a real challenge. We published at the beginning of this year, and you can find that through this URL that's on the screen, alongside the infographic I'm about to talk about. We published something called the Net Zero Barometer at the beginning of this year. That was a survey of businesses gauging their own progress on the road to net zero. And that told us very clearly that organisations are keen to do more, but actually one of the barriers was a lack of guidance, or lack of maybe clear guidance or where to go for guidance. So what we've done with this net zero infographic, which is available through that URL, is bring together what we're calling our key net zero suite of solutions, all in one place. And this includes, which I think is hopefully relevant to a BEAMA audience, examples of programs that have been designed for specific sectors. You can see those listed here, and that includes the energy sector as well. And there actually is within this net zero infographic more information about a recent program we've been developing with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, which is all centered around energy smart appliances, which has had input from BEAMA as well. So I would definitely urge you to go to that address and have a look at our net zero infographic, and really, as I say, sort of a one-stop shop for all of the key net zero standards. And the final slide, please, and thank you for letting me talk perhaps longer than 2 minutes. I wanted to highlight the fact that with the UK hosting COP26 next month, and BSI as the UK member for ISO, we led last month at the ISO General Assembly the development and agreement of something called the London Declaration. Now this seeks to make all standards Paris compliant. That is to say that all new standards, and then as they go on their own revision journey, all current standards will actively consider climate science and active transitions. This was agreed, as I said, at the ISO General Assembly in London last year, which we hosted. And as you can see here, it's also being endorsed, and again, this is very relevant to a BEAMA audience, also being endorsed by the IEC and by CEN and the electrotechnical standards body within Europe, CENELEC as well. And actually BSI as UK member of CEN and CENELEC, we remain active within that organisation despite EU exit as well. So I hope that quick summary gives you an idea of how we have actually look to support UK businesses in terms of where they can find net zero standards easily, but also gives you an idea of how really the standards fraternity is supporting the ambition of the UNFCCC, which is the organisation behind the COP summits, and further illustrates the role that standards can play in supporting organisations on their own net zero pathway. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. I think that's a really good way to segue us into the panel session. And I'm just going to give a roundup of those presentations now as the panel join us again to start this discussion. I think the message is loud and clear from the presentations that we've seen today, and really justifies why the industry commitment is so important. And that's how organisations like those joining us on the event today show leadership in drawing and bringing the supply chain with them on this journey. I think it's really apparent how valuable it is to share our commitments, how they're structured, the interim targets, because without an understanding of how the rest of the supply chain are doing this, I think we're not going to all get there and all move along this journey. I think the power of leadership from the organisations present today and those signing the BEAMA commitment is really strong. And with that, I'm going to, I've got quite a few questions actually that I've pulled together and that have come up during the presentations. But I think one of the most kind of apparent points that was made consistently was the challenge of measuring and reducing scope 3. So we heard from Stephen at SP Networks, our members are making products that are being put on their network. Our members therefore need to reduce the embedded carbon within those products. And then it goes further down the line because our members make complex products and components are sourced internationally. And it's really hard to get that data from a very complex international supply chain. So, I think it was it Olivia said, how do we build those competencies together to do this? I think that's a really important point. So my first question to the panel is, how can we tackle this really important area? Because while targets for scope 3 are a bit further down the line in terms of timing, we need to start looking at this now, because it does affect, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it may affect where and how products are manufactured and the supply chain that we use. So what can we do as an industry to help ensure we have a standard way of reporting on our scope 3? How can we source the data? And that compliance point that David mentioned, I think, is really important, because it has to be a compliant process. So I don't know I feel guilty picking out one person to target first. I don't know if anyone has an immediate reaction to that, or I probably will have to start picking out volunteers from the panel. But yeah, how do we tackle this growing issue around measuring scope 3? What could we do now as an industry to start addressing that? Stephen.
I'd be happy to jump in. So from our perspective, I think I mean, I've done carbon accounting for a number of years, and I think I think we need to, as an industry, define a common scope on what we report on. So I think it's unrealistic to model every single nut and bolt that goes into an electrical piece of equipment, although that should absolutely be the aspiration. We need to draw the line somewhere. So I think as an industry, we need to get together and really define a common scope that we're reporting on. So, if it's, when I say a common scope, like, we understand roughly, kilograms of steel, aluminium, etc. Come up with a common reporting framework and just draw a box around what we do include, understand that we can't include everything, and start reporting on the same page. And as we do that, I think as an industry, we'll start to, understand and we can start to work to reduce the carbon emissions and, maybe potentially increase the complexity as we go on. But I think we start simple, start doing things consistently, and then we build from there. And that's the way that I think we should, very much overcome the sort of data challenges.
Olivia, yeah.
I'm just going to build on Stephen's point, if that's all right. I think that's absolutely correct that we need to standardise it, but there'll still always be the challenge of how do we get the people in lower tiers to kind of come up with this data for us. And I think we can start with asking them the question. And, you know, certainly I've been asked a few of Stephen's questions in the past, you know, and that really helps, that motivates, that helps that sort of sense of direction. And if that question is standardised, it helps a heck of a lot more. But actually, at some point, we do need to start making decisions as companies that care about these things, that if if suppliers consistently can't supply us with that information, we will need to make choices to move away from them to suppliers who can. You know, because in the end, that's how you financially incentivize it. You buy from the people that can give you accurate carbon data and give you the lowest carbon product.
John.
Yeah, thanks. Just building on that, as an SME and as a supplier to the likes of Scottish Power and other DNOs, there's no question that if I were to listen to anybody in terms of what standards one has to meet from a company perspective, it would be my customers. You know, and there's no money, no funny as a driver, but you know, there are altruistic parts of what we're doing here, and there are not so altruistic parts. And as Olivia just said, you know, the ones who survive are likely to be the ones who listen most to what the requirements are. So I think I draw a parallel personally with how we've gone about developing our ISO 9001, our environmental policies, our health and safety policies. You know, yes, I'll be honest, in the early days, it's more of a tick box exercise than anything, but as that's driven through, it's started to add genuine value to the business. And that's the angle we should come at this from, most importantly, I think. But I would like to see standards developed whereby one is forced to, you know, meet certain requirements. That would help.
Thanks, John.
Hearing us all say it would help to have standards to be forced to do stuff, but I guess the sustainability people, it does help us to have that kind of consistency.
David, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes when I do the intro I did briefly, it's kind of first principles of, you know, who BSI is and what a standard is. And one word I forgot to mention there, which I often do put in, is the word voluntary. So what we shape are voluntary standards that may often get referenced within regulation. You know, energy savings opportunity scheme references ISO 50001, you know, as a means of demonstrating compliance. And I think the point we're making here is often get referenced in procurement, therefore they become contractually binding. So by the use of the word, some of you said the word force. I mean, are we talking there about, say, government mandating our standards, ISOs, ENs, etc., or are we talking about, or they being forced through contractual means, or a bit of both?
Can I quickly add? I think I used the word force, and it was probably the wrong word to use. But there's no question.
I wasn't picking up on that point.
No. But I think I did, and I think if we receive an RFQ or an ITT getting involved with tenders, there are simply a set of requirements within those documents that if you can't meet them, you're not on the list. That's what I meant, really. Permission to play, let's call it.
And I suppose it might be a balance between the two in terms of regulation and driven through customers. I think looking at regulated sectors like the utilities and networks industry, I suppose that's where collaboration with the supply chain and through trade bodies, we can help maybe ensure that customers are using the same standards and the same reporting requirements, and that just makes it far easier on the supply chain, and then that trickles down through the lower tiers that Olivia's referring to as well. Katie, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think, you know, for us from a supply chain, we've just started to obviously roll out our program around that. And the first piece, so we kind of stick to 3 A's at the moment. So we look at analytics, action and ambition. And that's how we've been speaking to our supply chain really for the last kind of 6 months. And like let's be clear, we have to collaborate with them right now. It's great to say, I need you to do this, but ultimately, sometimes they don't have the capabilities if they're a smaller company. Sometimes it's super complicated when we're looking at raw materials. We're asking them to give us a certain amount of information that they just don't have yet. So there has to be an element of collaboration when you're looking with supply chain. And I hear a lot of people say it all the time, and I know I'm kind of banging the same drum to an extent, but look, I would love that ultimately every organization in law is forced to do X, Y, Z, but we're not there yet. And there are a lot of organizations that are nowhere close to that. So we need to, those of us that have more resources, that have more knowledge, that have the ability to be able to help those smaller companies go on that journey, we feel have an obligation to do that. And that's what we're trying to do with our supply chain to begin with, is to work with them to at least figure out the data first. And then the next step is then say, right, okay, now we know what the data is. Now we can work on what the action plan needs to look like on how that kind of carbon emission comes down. And that's the case as well. We're getting more and more questions from people asking us, what's the embodied carbon in this product that I buy from you? Which is, going to another level. And some of them we definitely have answers to, some of them we don't still. And even at Schneider, we don't have all the answers yet. So I just think that ability to collaborate and be far more open is a kind of really crucial part when you're looking at Scope 3.
Olivia first, and then I'll come over to Lee.
A quick one, simply that there's also a load of win-wins in these supply chain conversations, these collaborations. I don't think any of us have mentioned it yet, that quite often you can find massive cost savings because you reduce carbon. It's a lens to look at things differently. And, sometimes it really drives positive change, both financially and for the sake of the planet.
I think the question is about business risk, right? Rather than, oh, this is something else that I've got to do. It's more, it's going to give me, it gives me more work. It's a real challenge. It's actually about saying, okay, well, what's the business risk if I don't do this? And if you start to speak about it in that sense, then I think people start to think of it in a very, very different way, as rather this, something else I've got to do. Actually, they start to say, no, this is a crucial part of our business continuity moving forward. And that's how you need to think about the supply chain piece.
Lee, did you want to step in there?
Yeah, just to support Katie's original statement. I mean, we're much more embryonic on our journey, I'd suggest, than many of the companies presenting today. And certainly we've been looking at Scope 3 over the last year, and the challenges it provides us really, really very, very material. As we've said, getting to the data from a number of suppliers is almost impossible. What we do know is, as a manufacturer, we know what materials we process, we know what steel we buy, we know what plastic we use, we know how we ship that to us, so we can estimate. And we've used third party to assist us in calculating our emissions, not something we can do on our own. And so we've got our emissions kind of third party assessed. But the challenges that provides, even at our level, let alone at the suppliers that we may have internationally, which come from very wide geographies, and using those guys to understand what they're actually creating from the point of view of carbon emissions in relation to the products that we buy from them, or the raw materials we buy from, is really, really quite a big challenge. I think the interesting thing is, it's a challenge just to identify your emissions, but there's a route I think that we could all take to improve the transparency around that, and I'm quite confident that it will come over time, of course. So that's one challenge. The next one is how we decarbonise. How do we reduce carbon from the things that we do? As I said, over half our Scope 3 will come from logistics, and I'm not sure how we decarbonise shipping, for example. How do we take carbon out? I don't know the answer. I'm sure the shipping companies might well have one, but what I have found is that an awful lot of this long-term commitment appears to be based on technology that doesn't exist. And actually, that's a real worry for me, that our future carbon planning is so much based on technology that doesn't exist, or a solution that's not yet found. What Volution has tried to do is, we've tried to focus much more on the short term and establishing things that we do know, understanding the processes that we are in control of, and technology that does exist now, and take steps towards it. And then as a society, well, I think we're going to have to move to a carbon or a net carbon neutral position over time, and hopefully to net zero over a longer period. But it's a challenge. I think that even identifying it is one challenge. Identifying, measuring it, capturing it, recording it appropriately, and second is, what do you do about it? and the nervousness I have is so much is based on things that you can't do yet.
That's a really important point, Lee. And I also know we've had a question through from one of the attendees as well around the topic of how you get that kind of call to action in your supply chain when they aren't able to provide the information that you're looking for. I think the comment comes from an SME who mentioned, you know, they're not able to move away from suppliers because they're small. It'd be too risky for them. Larger companies are maybe more able to do that. And I think maybe I'm hearing that that's probably initially at least the answer in driving change in the supply chain, is that some of these larger companies, maybe like Schneider, who are able to show some power in the market, can start making those moves, and then hopefully the rest of the supply chain will kind of move with them and understand what their requirements will be in terms of reporting that data down the line. And yeah, Lee, I also echo with you, along with just the reporting bit, there are technologies and approaches that we don't know yet, and there are areas of our emissions that we actually can't address yet, and they're going to be big challenges ahead of us. I'd like to move on to another question with that kind of segues in a little bit, in that we've talked a bit about there's lots of messages from the speakers here about the changes that are being made already within their businesses and that are going to need to be made. And I can't help but mention or pick up on the point that with that comes quite a big cost to a company. Whether you're a regulated business like a network company, utility, and then the manufacturers, these are big, significant changes. And I know hearing from Katie there was a really interesting example of how they're managing to pool funds to kind of finance some of those changes within the business, which is employee-led. I think that's a really interesting approach. But I suppose I have the question in, is this cost ever at the moment, you know, a limiting factor in progress within the business? That recognizing that this isn't regulated, a lot of these actions are being taken voluntary. Yeah, has anyone got any reflections on that? Is that a limiting factor at this stage? And does that maybe pin down certain areas that should be targeted for additional government support or regulation? Charles, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, this is an area that we're looking at quite considerably, as our members are quite often the customers of the organisations that BEAMA represents, and are increasingly looking at supply chain and skills as well in the same sort of strain, and looking at how the existing approach from government is very much segmented. There's a lot of siloed funding available for different things, but there's no real coordination of all of these approaches. And because of that, industry is increasingly having to step in this, because there is an inherent risk to spending a lot of money on updating your supply chains or reskilling, retraining your workers, only for them to then be poached by someone else, or for someone else to just leave that, defer that cost, steal all your customers, and then make the change slightly later on. So there is a real important factor in just getting everybody around the table, doing things like this, having a net zero commitment, and then with that intent, looking at what does that mean for interim targets? What does that mean for standards? How can you take the BSI standards and elevate those and use them and get everybody on board so that it is a clear pathway for government to then take on? And I think that is really the problem here, is that government will, and increasingly does, set long-term targets. If you look at electric vehicles as the example, they set 2040 as a target, and it was only upon industry pushing them and giving them a better understanding of how we can go faster that they then said, okay, let's bring that forward and let's give a bit more detail on how quickly we expect people to switch their sales of vehicles to electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. So having that combined industry voice, as BEAMA can offer, is really important to getting government to understand, look, these are the challenges, these are the barriers, and we need you to give us clarity here, here, and here. And as John mentioned, potentially create some sticks to force our hand so that we know that we're all spending that money at the same time, therefore undercutting the risk. So a broad view there. I think there is a key risk here in terms of government intervention as well. And looking to in energy industry examples, you've got electric vehicles where there was a lot of negative press about supply chains. Supply chain isn't net zero or it's not ethical, therefore don't bother. That mindset will continue across all technologies. So whatever you're trying to sell, someone will say, well, it's not quite perfect, so don't try. So we have to get past that. We have to be proactive and show that there is this pathway. This is what we think the best outcome possibly for consumers could be. And this is how we're going to deliver that. And getting ahead of that sort of government concern. The second is in renewables. Offshore wind quite often came across, butted heads with fishermen. Local fishing communities were particularly opposed to offshore wind, and government actively intervened there and has increasingly pushed the sector to localize supply chains, look at retraining local workers in order to integrate them into this installation in order to make them feel like it's part of something that they do. So increasingly you might see government intervening on things like localizing and nationalizing supply chains, sorry, not nationalizing, but bringing them into the UK, so onshoring. So getting out ahead of that, really critical.
Really important points there, Charles, thank you. I mean, I know on the localizing supply chains and reshoring, I don't know if any members have any have any comments to that, because I know one of the factors that have come up in discussions with our membership has been depending on when and how far we start seeing restrictions placed on embedded carbon in products and things like that, it could trigger decisions being made on how we develop more localized supply chains. I mean, we've heard that some of the biggest cost in terms of emissions and emissions come from our transport, shipping and freight, and these are really difficult to address issues. But you know, government need to help facilitate that kind of investment, because they are you know, big major decisions for companies to make. I don't know if anyone's got any reflections on that. Lee.
Oh yeah, we did a big exercise reshoring much of our assembly, let's say. It's frighteningly, but probably 7 or 8 years ago now. We had full products manufactured internationally and we ship them in, whereas now we assemble. What I would say, the supply chain complexities, we just can't get some of the componentry locally. It comes right back to primary industry at the end of the day, and where are materials made? Where are they mined out of the ground, or where are they formed? And in some instances, and certainly then when are they processed into a material that we can use? And unfortunately for us, a lot of the supply chain isn't available locally, or anywhere near at the cost base that would be needed to make our products commercially viable. Whether over time there's an economic model that has to be applied to that, I don't know. But certainly we've done an awful lot on our supply chain and trying to work out how we could materially improve it, but we still end up getting stuck on suppliers where we just can't buy the materials locally.
Thanks, Lee. No, that's a really important point. We're doing some research with the Energy Systems Catapult actually at the moment with our membership, looking at kind of, I suppose, what you might describe as pinch points in the supply chain, where we know we're going to need high volumes of product in the future. What are the key components and materials for those, and where are they sourced from? And are we going to potentially face some kind of global restrictions on accessing those, or will it really put pressure on our ability to decarbonise? And therefore, should government look at those kind of critical, high-risk supply areas now, so that in 10 years' time we have either a localized supply or an easy route into those industries wherever they're produced in the world? Got quite a few questions starting to come through. I'm just going to kind of jump in, and it's one directed at Lee and Katie. How valuable is it to link your targets to the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Do the benefits extend beyond accountability and visibility to customers and employees?
Yeah, go on, Lee. Of course, you can.
I can answer it relatively superficially. I think Katie probably have more insight, having been a bit further down the road than we are, for sure. I think from our point of view, what it did give us is a mechanism by which we could articulate the material things that we do. So we assessed what we do across our materiality analysis, as I explained in the presentation. I think really highlighting the things that we can impact and the things that our operations relate to. It enabled us to focus down on a few areas that are considered as important. I mean, the UN sustainability goals are only the next few years anyway, but it just enabled us to focus our areas of operations specifically, really, and the things that we do to help us articulate why they are the right thing for us to be doing. So much of it focuses on us doing the right thing to get a result over time. It's not all immediate. And I think that framework enabled us to articulate ourselves within a recognised framework already. So we're PLC, our investors, of course, see this being represented by a number of different organisations and people they invest in, certainly companies use them. But internally, I thought the framework assisted us in articulating our point in a slightly wider view of the world rather than just our own.
So I agree with Lee on that. And I think to take it kind of one step further as well, what the framework does allow you to do is to understand where in your value chain or in your supply chain you have risk. And it's about giving you that wider viewpoint on the impact of your business within society, not just within, your day-to-day runnings and day-to-day operations. And I think that's been a kind of crucial part. We looked at, if you look at the kind of SDG around below the sea, so under the sea, all of impact like that, we were like, well, what do we have to do with that? We sit in the grid, we don't really have anything. But actually, when you start to look through our value chain and you go through our supply chain, we realize actually, no, there was significant impact that we had there. So I think, and there was also risk there, so I think what the SDGs does allow you to do is, yes, absolutely communicate in a way with whether that's shareholders, whether that's customers, whether that's employees, on the wider impact that your business has, but also allow you to identify areas of risk that you need to focus on that are related to those SDGs, that ultimately lends to better business continuity in the future. So and also areas of growth. I think it allowed us to highlight areas where we had a kind of growing impact, and that had a positive effect on the business, and being able to align then our kind of our kind of strategy around growth and the SDGs allows you to make sure that you're kind of growing in the right way rather than growing in a way that has then a negative effect on the environments that sit around you. So yeah, I think there are kind of multiple benefits to aligning to the SDGs.
Thanks, Katie and Lee. I think that's a really, really good answer. I also, there was another question that came in referring to some of the comments that have been made around companies using third parties to help them calculate their emissions, because this is, your first major challenge in setting a net zero target is just measuring your baseline data, and it's not easy. I mean, we're doing it as BEAMA, and we don't make anything, so it's fairly straightforward in a way, and it's complicated. And then the question was, does BEAMA have any plans to help guide members through this process, at least maybe nominating third parties to help? In answer, yes, we are looking at this. It's very difficult for us to kind of pin down one provider over another for these services, but what we are doing is working with BEIS on the UK Business Climate Hub that they created, supporting the UN Race to Zero campaign. And through there, they're starting, it's early days, but they are starting to create sector guidance and signposting certainly SMEs to resources where you have available tools online and the relevant standards to make these calculations. But I do appreciate this is not an easy task, and I think we're working through this with our members to understand how we can help guide them further. I'm going to jump in on this kind of question around measuring and reporting. And Katie, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to pick up on this biodiversity point, because I think it's something that doesn't come up all the time in industry. We are at this early stage talking a lot about operational emissions and things like that. And I'm especially interested in how you referred to techniques and how you're actually creating a measure of biodiversity impact. How do you put a price on biodiversity, and how do you measure that into your kind of sustainability strategy? I think this is really, really interesting. And we've been talking about how we're asking our supply chain to report on embedded carbon. You're looking at your own sites and your own impact on local biodiversity impact, but have you done any work to ask your supply chain about their biodiversity impacts? I feel like that's the kind of next stage, and quite a challenging one, but one we'll have to deal with. I know COP is going to start looking at this in terms of international agreements on purchasing and biodiversity impact and impact on nature. But yeah, have you got any kind of reflections on that?
Yeah, so we haven't started it yet on supply chain. But I agree with you. It's the next step. And ultimately, you know, if we don't have healthy biodiversity, then we don't have societies in which our businesses can operate ultimately. So, you know, that it is very much a circular piece that we need to be kind of measuring and be aware of the impact. And it's everything from kind of water usage down to species on sites, and you can do that in many ways. So we've looked at so our kind of global report looked at mean species abundance, and then you look at, you know, how many species you have within a set kind of area around your sites and around wherever your kind of main manufacturing sites are, and there it's way above my pay grade, shall we say, but then there are you know, very technical things that are done to then understand then what our biodiversity score looks like. But there are much simpler ways of doing that. So if you take it from a site, for example, one of our sites, we sponsor the Duke of Edinburgh Awards, and our young people that do that within the business on a quarterly basis go out and do a species count around our sites, and that gives us data then to just be aware of, first of all, what is around our sites. And we've got, you know, sites. Our London site is in the middle of concrete London, very difficult to understand the species that sit around you, but we have other sites that sit out, you know, in countryside, amongst agriculture, and there is a huge impact then that our sites have on biodiversity. And it's also about taking biodiversity impact into account when you look at your carbon projects. So for us, when we're looking at a microgrid, for example, we're looking at more generation. Now, on some sites, it might even be we look at a small wind turbine, but we have to then think about the impact that has on biodiversity around that site. If we swap it for you know, a big solar plant, what's the biodiversity impact that has? So there are, you know, it's about also looking at a longer term vision around biodiversity, and ultimately it's coming right from a supply chain perspective. If we think carbon emissions are hard, biodiversity is going to be a whole new level, but it is coming down the line, and we're starting to see a lot more questions actually from customers. Where when we released our white paper this year, more than ever, we had customers say, well, what do you mean by biodiversity? So what are you doing? What do we need to be aware of? What should we be looking at? So the questions are coming and the interest is there. Again, it's going to be about data and about how you collect it. It's going to be about analysis of that data, and then it's going to be about how you show the impact that your actions have then on that kind of baseline. And that's challenging to show around biodiversity, because it isn't just the impact of your site, because obviously you don't just look at where your site sits, you look at the environment in which it sits. And so there are then multiple stakeholders probably on those kind of boundaries that have an impact on biodiversity. So that is in a whole nother level of collaboration that you need to consider. And our site in Coventry sits within Warwick University, and so we are working closely with them to understand what biodiversity looks like for their campus, and then how our site has an impact on that. So there has to be, you know, a kind of real key collaboration piece in order to do this. But yeah, it's not easy. Let's say it's tough. There's a lot of information, and you need experts, right? You need people who understand the environment. You need ecologists that will work with you to understand the impact of different projects. And most corporations don't have that level of expertise internally, so you have to look at where, you know, what organizations, NGOs, whatever it is that you work with in order to achieve that.
Thanks, Katie. Lee, and then David.
I mean, Katie's covered virtually, well, infinitely more detail than we certainly have at this stage. What I would say is we obviously are involved in various carbon offset projects as well, and I think it's key that the ones we've picked, we've tried to ensure they're biodiversity sensitive. I think that's a key one, covering Katie's point. I think also the interesting thing is that some of the decarbonisation technologies that are heralded as a potential way out of the problem may also impact biodiversity quite heavily. If you think biofuels, for example, basically agricultural crops and can significantly reduce biodiversity in areas that they're planted. So I think this path is a bigger challenge than measuring scope 3. I would certainly agree with Kate on that. I think it's a really big challenge, but one we can't afford to ignore for sure. Although we're probably more biodiverse now than we've ever been in the planet's history, it's still something we should treasure and certainly should aim to protect species for sure. But I think there is certainly a big challenge around it, and we're finding it it's quite enlightening as you dig deeper. But for sure, we have to be careful that the steps that we take to decarbonise don't in effect do more damage to biodiversity than potentially other technologies that might be out there.
Thanks. You probably never really expect me to jump in when someone talks about a topic, and I think, oh, I think we've got a standard for that. So the whole area of evaluating natural capital is one I think is part of a growing program of work we're doing. And I just, while Katie was talking, I just looked up. There was published this year actually something BS 8683, Process for Designing and Implementing Biodiversity Net Gain. Now, I think my understanding is that's been designed very much for the built environment. I guess it's part of a development project, a site, whether it's a housing development or a sort of a business park or factory. Now, whether that then can be applied to any sector that therefore is using a site to, whether it's food manufacturing or whether it's the energy industry, I don't quite know actually, if I'm honest with you. But I think certainly it's aimed at those who are doing the specking of the site initially, to understand what the impact, as Lee was saying, was what the impact of that project will have in terms of biodiversity and addressing net gain. So just to throw that into the mix. But obviously, if we do need to develop more sector-specific guidance, and that's again where hopefully our convening role, working with organisations like BEAMA, saying we need something more tailored to our needs, then we can hopefully bring people together in a room and come up with a solution.
And just to add to what David said, and he hit the nail on the head around natural capital, we have to be able to value the natural environment around us for us to care about it ultimately within a business sense. And right now we don't do that enough. We don't value in any shape or form and enough to an extent, whatever you want to say, the natural capital in which we rely on in order to continue to do business in the way that we do. So until people start to properly value the impact that they have on the natural world, then it is a real challenge to then think about what we do with it, because you get the whole, well, isn't this just a fluffy green thing that people are planting trees and doing? No, it's actually far bigger than that, and there is a real kind of value to be had on that natural capital side. So we need to start pushing that and speaking in that way to make sure then that we are kind of tracking, and ultimately, why don't we have a biodiversity P&L ultimately, right? That's the way we should be thinking about things moving forward, is where's your natural capital P&L, and that should be an integral line in everyone's P&L, right? And only once we get to that point probably will you start to see people really listen and really sit up and really take note, because then there's an actual kind of monetary value around it.
Thanks so much, Katie. I think this is a really important topic, especially pertinent with COP coming up. We know that biodiversity loss is an important focus of that work. And I think, like we said, if you think embedded carbon is hard, this is going to be even harder. But it speaks to the need for organisations like Schneider and others who are starting to look at this and are making progress. Sharing best practice is going to be absolutely key in setting out a way forward for the whole supply chain. And I think at BEAMA on assessing embedded carbon, on biodiversity, on all of this in the round, I think we're really keen to try and stimulate a lot more of this sharing of what we're doing, because I think it's so valuable in flagging up where we need to do more work and where we can collaborate. And speaking to that point around, it's not just embedded carbon. Now, the BEAMA commitment actually talks to that point exactly, in that this isn't just about carbon emissions. This is about creating sustainable products in the round. And I know, like Lee, you mentioned a lot of the work you're doing on material efficiency within your products, and a number of you mentioned the plastics that are used. We're starting to see some regulations come forward that are going to enforce change here, whether it's plastic packaging tax in the UK being kind of quite a well-known one at the moment, but more producer responsibility around the plastics that go into our products. How far, again, it kind of calls to the cost thing. This can be a costly change maybe if it's not enforced through regulation across the board. I mean, what are the challenges in finding a supply chain that's going to provide you with those sustainable materials, and how much does that supply chain maybe need to be regulated? Taking plastics as an example. Yeah, Lee.
I can expand on our experience a little bit. I think we have certain polymers that we use, and getting consistency in those polymers is quite important, because they have structural integrity and various other things that they bring to our products. So getting a purity of supply of material is the challenge for us. For certain products, it's less relevant than others, but certainly as a generalization, we need to be able to guarantee the quality of the recycled materials that we use. We've done an awful lot on supply chain, and we've found working with AO has been really advantageous for us, because AO recycling has been fascinating from the point of view of our learning. They basically collect white goods from people's houses when they sell them a new one, recycle those in their plant, and we know that those materials we've certainly been using them for a while now, and so we're comfortable with them, but we know that they're from a source that we understand. Our scale isn't huge, but to give you some idea, we use high impact polystyrene to make some connectors for ductwork that's used in our whole house heat recovery systems, a high impact polystyrene, and we still use the same amount of material that's used in roughly 63,000 fridges, even in our UK plant. So it gives you some idea of scale. We're not what I'd consider big, really, in that sense. We're FTSE 250, but employ 1,500 people or so, circa 300 million euro revenue as a group. But even we have managed to find a source that we can rely on that can deliver us materials that we've been able to sign long-term contracts for, so that we understand what we've got coming and when. Other materials have posed more of a challenge, and I suppose from our point of view, we'd like to get to a stage where if there is materials that are difficult to process for other applications, then maybe our industry could use them in building materials that potentially are hidden in the structure of the building, as long as they're structurally okay and they meet the demands of the application. And I suppose that would be our long-term objective, to get to a stage where we could potentially use materials that are difficult to process in other industries, that, in other words, would be a waste product if we didn't use them. We haven't got there yet, but over time we think that there is potential to expand in those areas and find a better use of the materials that are in the circular economy over time.
Thanks, Lee. And Olivia, do you want to jump in?
Just going to build on that take back kind of thinking, because actually circular economy isn't about waste hierarchy, it's about keeping products in their kind of life cycle longer, so prolonging them and reusing them and things like that. And actually a lot of the electrical products that we use in energy networks, so relays for instance, we now have take back schemes for those, and we store them, and then we can kind of refurb them and send them back out into the market for customers that want it. And those kind of little things that often, I mean, that started as an intern project in Siemens a couple of years ago, and is now something that we can actively do for our customers. It's those little things. It's not just about a single-use plastic. I mean, if I look at waste streams, it's a tiny amount of our waste stream, but circular economy and waste itself is so much bigger than that. And I think we do have to have that wider view, like polymers, recycled polymers, the kinds of materials we're using, and that kind of more systematic, more thinking about the financing models, especially with big industrial equipment. Leasing models are completely different. They completely change the way finance works in a company. And same would be true of carbon, actually. If we finance carbon investments very differently, suddenly you can do them, long-term PPAs, things like that. And I do think, again, it's that different lens. It's looking at things from a different angle to get the outcome. It's not just approaching it the same way and thinking you can keep making it more efficient.
Thanks, Olivia. We've only got 2 minutes left of the event, and one question I had, or one point I wanted to make, which I wanted to try and bring in at the very last minute, was around people and places. And I know a number of you have mentioned this. A number of you have mentioned how you're driving your sustainability commitment through employee-led processes. I think that's really important. And I just wondered if anyone has any reflections on on how that's being done. You know, you've got to embed it within the whole company rather than kind of enforcing this from top down. I don't know if any of the panelists have any comments on the work that's being done with the people within the organisation and helping them to lead this agenda. Lee. You're muted, Lee.
Apologies. Can you hear me now? Yeah, apologies. Yeah, we've put in place a biannual employee engagement session where the CEO and CFO chair it actually, and a large amount of time in that engagement is spent looking at localized sustainability initiatives. So we set a brief to the managing directors to identify areas of their business that they can improve environmentally, and we've found that has been quite an intriguing process, and one the staff are obviously very, very keen to get engaged with. We've had all sorts of different initiatives. It's led to about 1 million products that we sell across the group over the last 2 years, in fact the last 18 months, where we had single-use plastic in them that have now don't. They're now purely cardboard packaging, for example. We've had paperless offices and ways of communicating with customers don't involve printing stuff off. As another example, we have lots of them, and actually this year we're going to put a selection of them in our annual report to help explain some of the initiatives that our staff have found. But I think an awful lot of our long-term policy will be driven from the ground up. It can't just be driven from the top down. So we're doing similar things to others, in effect making local business units pay for their own carbon emissions. So they pay for it twice. They pay for the energy they're using, then they pay for the emissions they create, to encourage them to think about how they operate their business more effectively and get their costs down. So we've found the process of engaging with staff, one, relatively easy from the point of view of staff's willingness to engage in it. They certainly are very, very keen to do it. And I think over time we'll find lots and lots of initiatives across our group, that we already are, that will make a material difference to our sustainability in a wider sense, not just carbon, but in the actual things that we do on a daily basis, and reducing our waste, etc. And as Olivia pointed out earlier on, there is financial returns in improving these processes anyway. A lot of these steps start to reduce costs, because at the moment it's cost we spend that's potentially wasted. Anything that we can do there and reduce the cost enables us to improve the bottom line, of course.
Thanks very much, Lee. And Katie, very quickly, because I've got to close the event, but would you like to come in?
The final thing really is that our short-term incentive plan, so our annual bonuses, are now linked to our sustainability strategies and targets across the entire business. And that ultimately then means it's everyone's problem, because everyone has an invested interest in making sure that we hit those targets. And I think, you know, it takes a combination of Lee's approach, where you're engaging with your employees at that kind of level to understand and take them with you on the journey, and also learn from them and take their ideas and implement their ideas, as well as then, you know, the kind of financial element is always an added bonus, and that definitely makes a big difference to people's thoughts and viewpoints when it comes to sustainability in the business.
Thanks so much, Katie. And I think that's a really important message to maybe end the event on, in how this work has to be people-led and employee-led within businesses, and how you embed that culture is vital. I'd like to take this moment just to thank all our panelists for joining us today. I think it's been a really, really interesting conversation, and again, just demonstrates how important it is that we start sharing best practice across the industry on this. And there's a number of pieces of work that BEAMA will be taking forward in establishing more supply chain engagement for our members on this topic. And you know, if you have any questions, please contact me and visit the BEAMA Net Zero Hub. We have a platform on our website where we're hosting all this work, which is publicly available, and you can access all the material that we'll be publishing over the coming days and weeks as part of our Net Zero campaign with the industry in lead up to COP26. So thank you very much to everybody who's joined, and thank you for the attendees and the questions you've put forward, and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us. Bye-bye.